This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Ateli Edwards. Tonight's top stories. Iran under renewed attack after its newly installed supreme leader vowed to keep the world's busiest shipping channel closed. Drone attacks also on Gulf Arab states as the Middle East conflict hits the 2-week mark. Now, the squeeze on energy flows from the region, opening the door to Russian suppliers as Washington temporarily eases sanctions to steady international markets. Also, the Trump administration tries to rebuild tariff pressure, launching fresh trade probes into 60 economies for what it called failures to take action on forced labor. And Taiwan's opposition-controlled parliament finally green lights 4 U.S. arms deals after a political deadlock that fueled fears of sending the wrong signal to its strongest backer, Washington. Also tonight, China is pushing for intelligent robots to leave the lab and enter everyday life. But how close are we really to robots that can work in factories or even help out at home? U.S. and Israeli strikes have pounded Iran, with Iranian state TV reporting huge explosions in central Tehran, where crowds were earlier seen gathering to mark Quds Day. Meanwhile, the Islamic Republic has kept up its attacks against Gulf Arab states after new leader Mojtaba Khamenei pledged to continue targeting U.S. military bases. Well, air defense in Dubai intercepted Iranian fire, while Saudi Arabia says it drowned nearly 50 drones over the span of a few hours today. Well, Mr. Khamenei has also vowed to keep blocking the Strait of Hormuz as leverage. A Persian Gulf shipping and energy infrastructure continue to be targeted. An attack on Iraq's Basra port yesterday killed at least one person and forced authorities to halt operations at all of the country's oil terminals. Now, AP correspondent Philip Crowther joins us now live from Dibba in the UAE. Philip, first up, you are at the entrance of the Strait of Hormuz. Tell us, what is the situation there given the latest threat from Iran's new leader?
Yeah, this is it right here. This is the entrance to the Strait of Hormuz. We're here in the United Arab Emirates, just a very short distance from Oman. The Strait of Hormuz is controlled jointly by Oman and Iran. We can see 1 or 2 tankers in the distance from here. They haven't moved over the last few days. And when you crane your neck a little bit further out, you can see dozens, especially at nighttime. You can see the lights of dozens of tankers. They're just idling here, waiting to be allowed into the Strait of Hormuz, or rather they are waiting until it's safe enough for them to attempt that passage. The Strait of Hormuz has not been officially blocked by Iran by military means, for example. As far as we know at this point, there have not been mines laid, for example. But there have been over a dozen attacks on ships that have been either trying to enter the Strait of Hormuz or have during this conflict. And that just means it's too risky for oil companies, but also insurance companies are racking up their prices. So it's just deemed too risky to attempt this passage. Right now, we are seeing no movement back and forth, meaning that there are at least dozens of tankers waiting to enter the Strait of Hormuz where we are right now. And there are literally hundreds of ships inside the Persian Gulf trying to get oil out of that area from the Gulf countries, for example, but from Iran as well, of course, out into the wider world. And remember that a very large percentage of the world's seaborne oil traffic goes through the Strait of Hormuz. It's a fifth of all of that traffic, and a very high percentage thereof goes to Asia.
Right, very high traffic, as you have emphasized. Do we know if anything is being done to allow energy shipping to resume? And what about Trump's promise of these U.S. Navy escorts?
Yeah, so far we're not seeing any concrete actions. Essentially, the conclusion is that only diplomacy and an end to the war will lead to a reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Right now, as long as the United States and Israel keep on attacking Iran, there will be counterattacks from Iran, for example, on oil tankers, but also on Gulf countries like the United Arab Emirates, where I am, but also the likes of Qatar and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia as well, meaning this is just not safe passage for oil tankers right now. So what can be done militarily? Well, we've not seen any evidence of anything happening. Yes, US President Donald Trump spoke about the possibility of escorting oil tankers through the Strait of Hormuz. That has not happened yet. We are seeing no movement here. And indeed, it would most likely be deemed way too dangerous to do so, so long as Iran still has the possibility of attacking targets with drones or ballistic missiles. This is something that a French-led initiative is working on establishing as well, possibly being able to escort ships in and out of the Strait of Hormuz. But this is not something that is going to be happening in just a few days' time.
But Philip, what is this we're hearing? Reportedly, Iran allowing China and India-bound oil to go through. Do we know how credible these reports are? Do you see any evidence of this happening, given their ties with Iran?
Look, we've seen no movement back and forth here over the last few days, but there is an exception to there not being any international ships being allowed through. It's a tiny exception. Some tankers that are aligned, and not even just tankers, these might be other ships as well, who might be aligned with China, who might be flying under a Chinese flag, or might even just be saying that they are aligned with China, linked with China. One or two of them have been able to get through over the last few days, but that is very much the exception. What this is not is any kind of a deal between Iran and China allowing those ships to freely move through the Strait of Hormuz. There is no existing deal right now, and we're seeing no evidence thereof.
All right, thanks for that clarification. AP correspondent Philip Crowther in Dibba, UAE. Now, the close proximity of U.S.-aligned Gulf nations to Iran has drawn Tehran's missile capability into focus. And CNA's Angela Lim examines the country's arsenal of ballistic missiles.
Iran's ballistic missile arsenal covers distances from short to long, shaping the nation's strategic reach across the Middle East and beyond. Now, at the shorter end is the Shahab-1, with a range of about 300 kilometers. Missiles of this class can reach across the Persian Gulf from launch sites inside Iran, meaning parts of Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Oman could be targets. Now, another short-range system, the Fateh 110, extends that reach to roughly 300 to 500 kilometers, covering much of the same Gulf region. The Shahab-2 pushes it further to around 500 kilometers, expanding Iran's strike capability deeper into neighboring territory. With the Zolfaghar missile, the reach increases to about 700 kilometers. The Qiyam-1 extends that distance to about 750 kilometers, placing a wide swathe of the Middle East within striking distance, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, and Turkey. Now, at the longer end of Iran's missile arsenal are systems such as the Shahab-3, with a reach of up to 2,000 kilometers. Analysts say Iran has the largest stockpile of ballistic missiles in the Middle East. U.S. intelligence assessments note thousands of missiles across short, medium, and longer-range categories. Iran's ballistic missile program is assessed to be capable of carrying a nuclear payload. And the country's ongoing uranium enrichment has raised regional concerns, although Tehran says it's for peaceful civilian energy purposes. Together, these capabilities make Iran's missile program a central pillar of its strategic deterrence, one Tehran has shown little willingness to relinquish, while also fueling the current fighting in the region.
Meantime, Taiwan's opposition-controlled parliament has allowed the government to sign 4 U.S. arms packages after previously stalling proposals to increase the island's defense spending. Well, the back and forth over the military budget has sparked concerns, and officials warning that Taiwan risks losing its place in the production and delivery queue, which could send Washington, its most important international backer, the wrong message. Now, CNA's senior correspondent, Victoria Jen, she joins us live from Taipei. Vic, first up, perhaps break down the latest developments in Taiwan's arms purchases from the U.S. and what exactly is in this large weapons package and why is there such urgency now?
Well, Taiwan's parliament has now authorized the government to sign agreements with the U.S. for 4 major arms deals, after officials warned that missing the deadline could push Taiwan to the back of the global weapons production queue. Now, the weapons include TOW anti-tank missiles, Javelin missiles, and the HIMARS multiple launch rocket system. Many of these systems are designed to what Taiwan calls asymmetric defense, mobile weapons that can slow down or disrupt a much larger invading force. For example, the HIMARS system can launch precision rockets over long distances, while Javelin and TOW missiles are used to destroy armored vehicles. Taiwan's defense ministry says the agreements, known as letters of offer and acceptance, must be signed before March 15th. Otherwise, Taiwan risks delays in production and delivery. Analysts say these systems are meant to strengthen Taiwan's ability to respond quickly in the early stages of a conflict.
就是这一次的这个发价书所提供我们的武器，就如同我所提到，它比较像是防卫反击的这样子的武器。那这些武器因为都是美军最新型的武器，所以当我们获得这些武器，确实在某一部分能够补强我们刚刚讲在防卫反击上面的这样子的一个反制跟威吓的能力。
So beyond the military value, these purchases also send a signal about Taiwan's efforts to strengthen deterrence with support from Washington.
So, Vic, we know that Taiwan's defense budget, well, that has been stuck in parliament for months. So do you think it's because of recent geopolitical tensions that's pushing the political parties toward some kind of compromise?
Well, there are signs that Taiwan's political parties may be moving towards at least a partial compromise, particularly when it comes to urgent arms purchases. President William Lai's government has proposed a $40 billion special defense budget aimed at boosting Taiwan's military capabilities. But the opposition, which holds the most seats in parliament, has blocked the proposal, saying lawmakers should not approve what they call blank checks. However, with the deadline for signing these U.S. arms agreements approaching, lawmakers from both sides agreed to allow the government to move ahead with the deals first, even before the full budget review is completed. Analysts say the bigger debate over the defense budget is still far from settled.
这些预算内容其实包括了更多有关于提动，就是所谓台湾之盾的防空的相关的这个建构那这个部分可能会是更核心的台湾的防卫能力的强化所以我相信这中间还有很多朝野之间的角力。现在虽然是一个好的开始，可是后面恐怕还有更多的角力会在这个会期持续的拉扯。
So while today's move helps Taiwan avoid delays in key weapons purchases, the larger political fight over defense spending is likely to continue. Ateli?
Many thanks for that update. CNA senior correspondent Victoria Jen in Taipei. Coming up on East Asia tonight, Hong Kong is revamping its listing regime as it looks to attract fast-growing companies by easing requirements on dual-class shares. And as U.S. export limits tighten, ByteDance is said to be turning offshore using NVIDIA's most advanced AI chips to power new systems beyond mainland China. Hello again. Good to have your company this Friday evening. It is now time to get you up to speed in business with none other than Olivia Mazuki. So, Liv, tell us more about what Washington is doing. I mean, they've temporarily allowed purchases of Russian oil to cool fuel prices.
Well, I'll tell you, so Washington is trying to curb and trying to blunt the impacts of rising fuel prices stemming from the bottleneck in the Middle East. And so the U.S. says it is further easing sanctions on Russian crude as it scrambles to dampen soaring fuel prices brought on by the disruptions in the Persian Gulf. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says Washington is temporarily allowing countries to purchase Russian oil that is currently out at sea. Mr. Bessent adds that the measure is narrowly tailored and will not significantly benefit Russia financially. Last week, Washington allowed India to import Russian oil, reversing months of pressure on New Delhi. Meanwhile, the surge is benefiting Russia, which has brought in $150 million per day in extra revenue. Based on analysts' estimates, there are currently up to 150 million barrels of Russian crude at sea, the bulk of it around Indian and Chinese waters. The U.S.'s latest easing applies to Russian oil cargoes loaded through to the 11th of April. Well, Russia also seeing this as an opportunity to pile more pressure on the U.S. over oil sanctions. Moscow says the global energy market, quote, cannot remain stable without its oil. Its presidential envoy says the easing of sanctions is becoming increasingly inevitable as the war strangles supplies. Governments in Asia are confronting a worsening energy crisis spurred by the war in the Middle East. The Strait of Hormuz is an essential passage for the oil market, handling about a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade. Gulf countries such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE all ship their crude oil through there. U.S. government data shows around 90% of the crude transiting through the strait last year was headed for Asia, with China as the top destination. Beijing has since ordered an immediate ban on refined fuel exports this month in anticipation of a possible domestic fuel shortage. South Korea had a price cap on fuel that takes effect today. Officials have also agreed to provide energy vouchers to vulnerable households. The country relies almost completely on imports for its energy needs, with 70% of its oil purchased from the Middle East. Now, Thailand has capped diesel prices until Tuesday, which is when the cap will be reassessed. Authorities are also eyeing more use of renewable energy, with preparations to boost energy output from domestic coal-fired power plant. And in the Philippines, which analysts say is one of the most exposed to oil price shocks, some local governments are shifting to a 4-day work week in a bid to reduce fuel demand. Well, Bangladesh has shut universities and limited fuel sales as part of emergency measures to conserve energy. The country relies on imports for 95% of its power needs. Also in South Asia, Nepal has begun to ration cooking gas amid concerns of a possible nationwide shortage. Residents in Kathmandu say that the country is struggling to meet demand as they stand in snaking queues for hours for petroleum gas.
अहिले अब ग्यास सर्टेज छ बजारमा गयो डिलरमा गयो नाम लेखाउनु पर्छ त्यो कहिले नाम लेखाइराखे त्यो पाउने कहिले त्यो थाहा छैन.
East Asian markets wrapping the week on the back foot as investors are spooked by Middle East tensions. South Korea's Kospi leading the declines, nearly 2% down, and in Tokyo, the Nikkei down more than 1%, extending its loss of about 8.5% since late February before the conflict escalated. We're seeing dramatic fall across tech giants such as SoftBank and chip equipment maker Advantest. Honda sank more than 5% after forecasting its first annual loss in nearly 70 years, tied to hefty EV restructuring costs. Well, Greater China tracking broad weakness in regional peers as traders are bracing for a prolonged conflict and higher oil prices. Speaking of oil, despite the U.S. trying to ease supply concerns by issuing a license to buy Russian crude, Brent is still trading at high levels at around $100 a barrel, WTI at 95.60 cents. The two futures soar this week to their highest since June 2022. And the U.S. has launched investigations into 60 economies over what it calls failures to address forced labor in supply chains. The move comes as President Donald Trump's administration seeks to rebuild tariff pressure after the U.S. Supreme Court struck down his global levies last month. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer says the probes will examine whether foreign governments have taken sufficient steps to block imports of goods produced with forced labor and how any failure affects American workers and businesses. The list includes Singapore and major U.S. allies such as Canada, Australia, and the EU, as well as China and Russia. These investigations follow a separate announcement that Washington will probe 16 trading partners over alleged excess industrial capacity. Both cases fall under Section 301 of the U.S. Trade Act of 1974. Earlier on CNA, my colleague Rani Samtani spoke with Deborah Elms from the Heinrich Foundation, who explained how the fresh trade probes are different to the ones announced earlier this week.
Well, we've had a couple of different changes in trade policy. So one is originally to use something called IEEPA, the Emergency Powers Act. That's the one that gave globally applied tariffs. That was struck down by the Supreme Court, as you noted. It was replaced by a sort of temporary 10% across the board. That expires in July. And so between now and July, the U.S. administration seems determined to rebuild that wall. And one way to do so is to use different tariff rules. And ultimately, at the end of this investigation process, which is going to come very fast, and certainly before July 27th, when these temporary tariffs expire, we will have presumably new tariffs in place. And it may be the case that they exactly line up with the tariffs that you had under the original IEEPA statute.
Is there a chance that these new duties could be stacked on top of the blanket 10%? I mean, I know you mentioned that they're set to expire. There was a 150-day expiry date. But Mr. Trump said during his State of the Union address that they weren't going to expire and that they would remain in place. So how exactly would this all work?
Well, it is terribly confusing, but let me just say that the current 10% on this temporary rule called 122 are set to expire on July 27th. I think it would be difficult for the administration to extend them. They could cancel that temporary case. They could open a new temporary case, but there's going to be some real legal challenges in the U.S. around that. So their preference is to move everybody who they want to tariff into new categories, which is why we have seen these two launches of Section 301 this week. We may see more coming soon on different areas like digital trade, areas in environment, pollution levels. It's very unclear, but there should be a lot of them coming, I think. And there are also sector-specific tariffs, some of which we've already seen in steel, aluminum, copper, autos, auto parts, lumber, sofas. But others could be in the pipeline, including semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, electrical products, drones, critical minerals, et cetera. And so we have two different authorities that this administration is trying to use as more durable, long-term tariff authorities that will not be easily overturned by the Supreme Court.
Hong Kong is taking steps to make it easier for more companies to list in the city-state, especially for the new economy players. The stock exchange operator, HKEX, is proposing to lower the entry bar for those with dual-class share listings. That would let founders keep extra voting power even after going public. Under the plan, the minimum market value threshold would be lowered to 6 billion Hong Kong dollars. That's around 766 million US dollars. And the revenue requirement will be cut to just 600 million Hong Kong dollars, or around 76 million US dollars. This would be the biggest revamp of Hong Kong's weighted voting rights regime since it launched in 2018, as it comes as ongoing geopolitical tensions cloud the outlook for some Chinese firms listed in New York. But there's a balancing act here. As Hong Kong tries to bring more IPOs back, regulators are also tightening scrutiny after arrests this week linked to an alleged insider trading and corruption case. ByteDance reportedly managed to have circumvented U.S. export controls, preventing direct sales of advanced AI chips to China. The Wall Street Journal reports it is assembling computing systems outside of the mainland using NVIDIA's top AI chips. The Chinese tech giant is partnering with Aulani Cloud to use roughly 36,000 B200 chips to build 500 computing systems in Malaysia. The hardware build-out would likely cost more than $2.5 billion. Last month, the U.S. permitted ByteDance to buy NVIDIA's H200 chips with a 25% tariff on sales, but the company has not agreed to the terms. For over 3 years, Chinese tech firms have faced U.S. export controls, barring NVIDIA from selling advanced chips, including the Blackwell series, to China. Executives say that the restricted access to computing power is hampering AI development. And that's all I have for you this Friday, Otelli. It's back to you.
Thanks, Olivia. Have a great weekend.
You too.
Right, on that note, it's time to go for another break. But coming up on East Asia tonight, ripple effects are reaching East Asia after the U.S. scrambles to reinforce bases and military assets in the Middle East. This is East Asia tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. Trump administration launches fresh trade probes into 60 economies for what it called failures to take action on forced labor as it seeks to rebuild tariff pressure. Iran under renewed attack after its newly installed supreme leader vowed to keep the world's busiest shipping channel closed. Drone attacks also on Gulf Arab states as the Middle East conflict hits the 2-week mark. And the squeeze on energy flows from the region, opening the door to Russian suppliers as Washington temporarily eases sanctions to steady international markets. But the United States is scrambling to reinforce its bases and assets in the Middle East against Iranian drone and ballistic missile attacks. Well, that effort having knock-on effects in East Asia. Well, U.S. media report interceptor missiles were removed from a THAAD battery in South Korea as Washington shifts its air defense resources. According to local reports, President Lee Jae-myung said that Seoul voiced opposition but could not block that decision. The South Korean leader played down the move, saying it will not seriously weaken deterrence against North Korea, citing a layered shield that includes U.S. Patriot systems and domestically developed interceptors. While mounting concerns also in Taiwan, which relies heavily on U.S. support to deter a vastly better armed China, which claims the island. Local media report a Defense Minister, Wellington Koo, saying that the U.S. has not approached Taiwan about transferring weapons and that any redeployment will require a formal request from Washington. Well, for more insights on this, let's bring in Alessio Patalano, Professor of War and Strategy in East Asia, King's College London. Well, thanks, Prof, for joining us this evening. So we have seen the U.S. move significant military assets toward Iran. How concerned should allies in East Asia be right now?
So first of all, we know that President Trump has been repeatedly saying that the major combat operations in the Middle East should have been planned to last within the sort of 5-6 weeks window initially. And the requests that have been presented to South Korea fall within that broader window. In other words, the first point to make is that the Americans have been sort of suggesting that they might redeploy some assets from South Korea towards the Middle East and already for a few days. So this was to be expected. Perhaps was less expected was the extent to which Iran would expand its attacks with drones and missiles to states in the Gulf. So the problem is not so much American military power, but more about providing additional coverage to allies in the Gulf states. If the situation, however, continues to evolve in a way that is favorable to air control by and large by the United States, which was the main objective of the operations, then within the next 2 to 3 weeks, we should see sort of an ease of that potential request of additional assets being removed from the region. Otherwise, we might be seeing additional requests coming from the American administration towards key allies in the region, notably South Korea, Japan, possibly Taiwan, to temporarily redeploy some of the assets to complete that sort of a gaining of stronger air superiority in a Middle East campaign.
Right, so you talked about this 5 to 6 weeks window, but in the event that the war actually drags on, what kind of security gap do you think would realistically emerge in the Indo-Pacific?
So that is a very good question. And I think it's a legitimate question that one should be sort of on the back of many minds. Now, as I said, I think that we need to qualify the demand for this deployment, redeployment of assets from the region towards the Middle East is in response of supporting Gulf states rather than directly military operation. As a result of that, within the window of 5-6 weeks is important, but it's not the only factor. The other factor to take into consideration is the extent to which, by the time the Americans feel that they had gained sufficient air superiority over Iranian skies, what will be left of more mobile Iranian capabilities, to what extent the Iranians will continue to use them towards the Gulf states. Because if targets shift to predominantly shipping or indeed American assets, then the additional redeployment might not be necessary, even if operations continue past the 5-6 weeks window. But if that's not the case, then very much I think the conversation will have to happen. And as a result, I am pretty sure that already Seoul, Tokyo, leadership in these main capitals have been thinking about the fact of how to complement and how to, in a way, how to close that gap. The most important thing to say here is that, particularly when it comes to Japan, Japan has been investing heavily in developing its own medium-range defense systems, in particular from missile and drones. And we will see the first sort of iteration of this system becoming operational in April. So there might be a gap, but it might be within the sort of over shortly thereafter, a comeback from within the region of new systems coming up online to complement that temporary gap.
But while all this is happening, do you think countries like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan right now, they're starting to maybe quietly plan a future where the US might be stretched too thin, although obviously they're not going to say that publicly?
I think you're absolutely right, but this is already happening. In many ways, the conversation with the Trump administration about raising investment into defense is not coming in a vacuum. Whether you are in South Korea, in Taiwan, or Japan, or indeed in the Philippines, the regional security landscape is already seen as severe as one could possibly imagine in terms of like the transformation and development of the last few years. So there is already a wider social license and acceptance that more investment in defense is required. And many of the steps have already started to be taken. So I think in this respect, you're absolutely right that you will see some changes, but some of these changes and some of these demands draw upon the advantage that this has been a conversation with the Trump administration in particular since day one. In fact, already during the campaign, particularly South Korea and Japan, had started to reorganize themselves to be able to meet the expectations of the American administrations. So in that sense, I think for different reasons, key allies in the region are already psychologically prepared with an American ally that will be perhaps slightly less present in certain aspects of the security architecture and the capabilities that underwrite it.
So, sometimes when major powers are preoccupied elsewhere, others sometimes test the limits. And I want to bring in that gray zone factor, especially in periods like this. Do we typically see more activity in what, analysts call the gray zone actions that basically stop short of open conflict?
Absolutely. I think this is a long-term trend that we've seen since 2020. The so-called gray zone has expanded in frequency, has expanded in typology of coercive activities, and it's been systematic year on year. So I think the real question really behind, or the real answer to your question is, to what extent a trend that is a consolidated trend will accelerate the moment in which there is a growing perception that the United States is distracted elsewhere, and therefore there is a window of opportunity to normalize higher levels of acceptance of military coercion or sub-threshold gray zone type of activities. I think this is a real risk, and is a risk that we're likely to get a much better sense, certainly between now and the summer, because we know from past experience of the previous year, or the last few years for sure, that the build-up towards the main summer exercises usually is always a good indicator of how far other actors will try to push the security envelope to, again, normalize higher thresholds of coercive gray zone activities.
So I need to bring in the vulnerabilities in the Taiwan Strait because the Taiwanese lawmakers, they have warned that U.S. military assets cannot be deployed in two places at the same time. So from a strategic standpoint, do you think this create real vulnerabilities in Taiwan Strait?
This might very well be creating some real vulnerabilities. I mean, in fairness, I think the debate in the Taiwanese yuan has been one such that even their request for additional weapons, the budget earmarked for it has been debated. So there is a question of a gap in capabilities, but also what perhaps the psychological opposite effect that an America that is slightly more distracted might create in terms of removing some of the objections in the Taiwanese yuan around investing into defense and guaranteeing more sort of continuity into investment into defense, or indeed push the political debate in Taiwan to create some sort of stabilization in the relationship with China and therefore planting the conditions for a less tumultuous and turbulent, if you want, Taiwan Strait scenario. It could be one or the other. Both are in place. Both will be sort of determined by the type of the relationship or the implications of a slightly more absent United States might create, particularly in the Taiwanese political landscape.
Right, and Professor, I want to talk about THAAD in South Korea. Was supposed to show America's serious about defending Asia. We've heard, President Lee tried to block that. It didn't happen. So the fact that parts of it getting moved out, I mean, that weakens trust, right? I mean, even though it's temporary.
So, I mean, already back in the late 2010, when the whole THAAD question sort of exploded, ballooned, and created genuine tension between South Korea and China, some of the sort of final solution around it was to keep part of the capability present there. So if you want, already, as it stands, the contribution that THAAD does is very much about a political statement of commitment rather than just a pure military capability to defend South Korea. I think the point that was mentioned in that you yourself sort of mentioned earlier about the commitment of the South Korean government and the South Korean position that they have also capabilities that they are deploying. That is an incredibly more important point in this context, because what it does is actually empowering the South Korean government with greater control over the direct threat that Fed should be addressing, and that is North Korea, by sort of placing at the front line the South Korean sort of contribution to that space. And in fairness, what we could also say is that if that is successful, if there's a sort of a larger effort in sharing the burden of defense of the Korean peninsula by South Korea sort of achieve the intended effects, then we might very well see that these temporary changes might become slightly more permanent and contribute to a rethink of the role of South Korea in the context of the South Korea-US relationship for the stability of the broader Korean peninsula.
Well, it's been a great conversation. Appreciate your insights. Eliseo Patalano, Professor of War and Strategy in East Asia, King's College London. Thank you. Now, North Korea, meantime, has accused Japan of raising security risks in the region after Tokyo started work on deploying new long-range missiles. Well, state media KCNA says the military buildup puts neighboring countries within striking range. And Pyongyang has called Tokyo's actions a dangerous military scheme, saying it amounts to preparations for a renewed invasion. Japan is planning to deploy its first batch of domestically developed long-range missiles at the end of the month in the southwestern prefecture of Kumamoto. Now, the upgraded land-to-ship missiles have a range of about 1,000 kilometers and can reach most of North Korea. Missiles would also have mainland China and the waters northeast of Taiwan within range. Now, the deployment comes amid rising tensions between Tokyo and Beijing after Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi suggested last year that any Chinese military action against Taiwan could be grounds for a Japanese military response. Well, the comments have drawn a sharp diplomatic backlash from Beijing. ASEAN's foreign and economic ministers have called for an immediate halt to the war in the Middle East as the crisis continues to spill over, disrupting trade and causing oil prices to surge. Philippine Trade Secretary Cristina Roque also urged the bloc to strengthen its regional resilience as conflicts in the Middle East rattles global markets.
Recent developments in the Middle East reminds us of our interconnectedness. Geopolitical tensions are no longer distant headlines. They are immediate economic shocks. They manifest in volatile energy markets, disrupted shipping lanes, and shifting investor confidence. For ASEAN, resilience is no longer an aspiration. It is our primary shield. While we remain the global champions of open market, the current landscape demands that the openness be backed by coordination and foresight.
Well, no surprise that escalating conflict in the Middle East and the shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz has sent shockwaves through global energy and financial markets. The widening conflict is expected to dominate today's talks as ministers assess the impact of surging oil prices and disruptions to shipping, logistics and trade. Our short break is up next, but coming up on East Asia Tonight, U.S. and Chinese top economic officials are meeting in Paris tomorrow to resume dialogue on their trade truce ahead of a summit between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. The U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is set to meet Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng in Paris this Sunday for a new round of trade talks. Both sides are preparing for U.S. President Donald Trump's meeting with Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping in Beijing at the end of the month. And China's Commerce Ministry confirmed that Mr. He will travel to Paris tomorrow through Tuesday to discuss trade and economic issues of mutual concern with the American delegation. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer will also take part in those meetings. Washington has provided few details about its objectives for the talks, though Mr. Bessent said yesterday that economic dialogue between the two is moving forward. Mr. Bessent and Mr. He have led trade negotiations since last year after Washington imposed sweeping tariffs on Chinese imports, triggering tit-for-tat escalation. Well, the truce eventually reduced the U.S. emergency tariff rate on Chinese goods to about 20% and partially restored rare earth supplies. The U.S. Supreme Court has since ruled Mr. Trump's emergency tariffs illegal. China says that it wants intelligent robots to move beyond the lab and into real life. Well, that message ran through this year's National People's Congress in Beijing. CNA senior correspondent Tan Yu-Guan reports from Hangzhou.
China's robots grabbed global attention at this year's Spring Festival Gala. Kung fu moves, sword swings, the whole spectacle. But here's the key question. Is this a preview of everyday robotics or just a great stage show?
They're definitely more agile than I am, but it's still a rehearsed routine. It makes me wonder, how far are show robots from doing something useful for me at home, like bring me my morning coffee?
That question brought me to Unitree, the company behind the Gala robots. A human greets me, then a robot follows. Not just any robot, it's the sword-wielding star of that Spring Festival Gala show, or at least its twin.
他没有穿服装，其实这个就是那个春晚上在挥剑的那个机器人，不是吗？
对对对，是的，是同一款机器人。
哦，那除了挥剑之外，它还可以做些什么东西啊？
哦，今天可以让我们的 HR 给你打一下拳。
那它可以挥剑，可以打拳啊，都在打架了。那除了打架之外，它可以做些什么东西啊？
其实不算是打架，我们只是说可以在这种比较激烈的碰撞下去展现我们机器人的一个性能。
我注意到你还有那个小型的机器人，那它功能有什么分别？
那这个小型的机器人主要面向的是像一些高校、科研院所和这种一些 AI 公司，它会基于我们的这个 G1的人形机器人去做2次的开发。那我们机器人提供一个这样的硬件平台，那客户可以在这个平台上面去进行运动控制算法的开发，或者是机器人大脑能力的开发，以及各种各样应用场景的开发，比如说像是在医疗呀、物流啊等等。
That's when it clicked for me. In The Wizard of Oz, the Tin Man didn't have a heart. And these robots, what they need is a brain. A real one. For messy, unpredictable, real-world situations. Even in this demo, the robots are at best remote-controlled gadgets.
我们现在机器人还是处在一个小孩子或者说是青少年的阶段，我们也是要给机器人一个更多的时间去成长。目前整个行业面临比较大的卡点，就是机器人目前是没有一个思考或者是决策能力的。比如说让机器人去帮我拿杯水，或者说去帮我打扫个房间，这对于机器人来讲目前还是比较难实现的。但是这个也是我们最终希望机器人能去达到的一个状态。
Still, the progress is real. Training robots to move is no longer about writing endless code. They can mimic human movement more directly now. And in China, the biggest shift is this. Robots are getting cheaper, fast.
像是电机、雷达、减速器、控制器都是自产自研的，可以减少重复的跟外部沟通交流的时间，大规模的量产跟交付也是可以很好的去降低我们的生产成本。那再一个就是中国在制造业也是比较的发达，供应链体系也是比较的完整的。
Unitree says some models start as low as 85,000 yuan, or about $12,000 US, roughly the price of a small car in China. If production scales up, prices could drop further. At the just concluded political meeting in Beijing, Premier Li Qiang pointed to the pace of the industry, saying China's industrial robot output rose 28% last year. In fact, there are so many Chinese companies making humanoid robots that the state planner has to ask companies to avoid repetitive products. But perhaps, like what happened in the boom in China's EV industry, humanoid robots could become a part of many households in China soon. So while truly intelligent robots may still be a work in progress, for the first time, it feels like there's a real chance one could help out at my home within my lifetime. Tan Yuguan, CNA, Hangzhou, China.
But Chinese robotics is not only about the big boys like Unitree. On Monday, Rebecca Mateo shows you the smaller players in the second part of our two-parter on embodied AI. And on that note, it's time to wrap up Friday's edition of East Asia Tonight. I hope you've enjoyed the bulletin. For more, you can go to our headlines anytime at cna.asia and find us on the socials, Facebook and YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great weekend.